Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through time that will carry you back nearly 4,000 years to the golden sands of ancient Egypt and one of humanity's most remarkable literary treasures. Tonight, we will explore together the complete Tale of Sinuhe, a story so captivating and beautifully crafted that it has survived millennia to reach us today, preserved in the dry desert climate that has kept Egypt's secrets safe for countless generations. As you settle into comfort, preparing for sleep, imagine yourself in the quiet halls of the Egyptian Museum in Berlin, where fragments of papyrus rest behind protective glass, their hieratic script still legible after nearly 40 centuries. These fragments, along with others discovered in various archaeological sites across Egypt, contain what scholars consider the crown jewel of Middle Kingdom literature, the story of Sinuhe, a tale that speaks to universal human experiences of exile, longing, identity, and the eternal pull of home. The tale of Sinuhe was discovered not in the tomb of a pharaoh, but scattered across multiple sources, testament to its popularity in ancient times. The most complete version comes from the Berlin Papyrus, designated Berlin Papyrus 3022, which dates to around 1800 BCE, though the story itself is believed to have been composed earlier, during the reign of Sesostris I, around 1875 BCE. Additional fragments have been found on Astraka limestone, flakes used as writing surfaces by ancient scribes, suggesting that this tale was so beloved that students copied it as a writing exercise, much as school children today might copy classic poems or stories. What makes this discovery so remarkable is not merely its age, but its literary sophistication. The tale of Sinuhe represents the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian narrative art, combining historical elements with personal drama, political intrigue with intimate psychological insight. It is simultaneously an adventure story, a political thriller, and a profound meditation on what it means to belong somewhere, to have a homeland that calls to your very soul. The story is set during one of Egypt's most glorious periods, the Middle Kingdom, specifically during the 12th dynasty, when Egypt had recovered from the chaos of the first intermediate period and was experiencing a renaissance of art, literature, and political stability. This was the age when Egyptian civilization reached new heights of cultural achievement, when the great pyramids of the Old Kingdom were already ancient monuments, and when Egypt's influence extended far beyond the Nile Valley into Nubia, the Levant, and beyond. Our protagonist, Sinuhe, serves as a royal attendant in the court of Amenhotep I, the founder of the 12th dynasty, a pharaoh who would be remembered as one of Egypt's greatest rulers. But as our tale begins, we find ourselves at a moment of profound political transition, when the death of a king sends ripples of uncertainty throughout the kingdom, and one man's fate becomes forever intertwined with the destiny of nations. Literary structure of the tale of Sinuhe follows a sophisticated pattern that would influence storytelling traditions for centuries to come. It begins in the royal court, moves through exile and adventure in foreign lands, and concludes with return and reconciliation. This pattern departure, trial, and return would later become fundamental to heroic narratives across many cultures. But here we see it perhaps in its earliest and most refined form. What makes Sinuhe's story particularly compelling is its psychological realism. Unlike many ancient tales that focus primarily on external adventures, the tale of Sinuhe delves deep into the protagonist's inner life, his fears, his doubts, his homesickness, and his struggle to maintain his identity while living among strangers in a foreign land. The anonymous author demonstrates a remarkable understanding of human nature, creating a character who feels as real and relatable today as he did to Egyptian readers nearly 4,000 years ago. The historical backdrop of our story is crucial to understanding its full significance. Amenhotep I had come to power after a period of political instability, and his reign marked the beginning of a new golden age for Egypt. However, his death, which may have involved assassination, created a moment of vulnerability that ripples through our narrative. The political tensions of succession, the loyalties of court officials, and the delicate balance of power that maintained Egypt's stability all play crucial roles in shaping Sinuhe's destiny. As we prepare to embark on this ancient journey together, let your mind travel back to a world where the Nile was the highway of civilization, where pharaohs were considered living gods, and where the written word was still a sacred technology possessed by a privileged few, the scribes who preserved. This tale for us understood that they were recording something precious, not just a story, but a window into the human soul that would speak to readers across the vast expanse of time. The morning sun cast long shadows across the royal palace as Sinuhe attended to his duties on what would prove to be the most fateful day of his life. He served as an attendant to Princess Nefru, daughter of Pharaoh Amenhotep I, a position of considerable honor and responsibility in the intricate hierarchy of the Egyptian court. The palace buzzed with its usual activity: scribes hurrying with their scrolls, servants carrying offerings for the morning rituals, and courtiers gathering in small groups to discuss matters of state and ceremony. But on this particular morning, something was different. There was an undercurrent of tension, whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when others approached, and meaningful glances exchanged between high officials. Sinuhe, trained in the subtle arts of court observation, noticed these signs, but could not yet comprehend their significance. He was about to learn that in the dangerous world of royal politics, even the most loyal servants could find themselves swept away by forces far beyond their control. The pharaoh, Amenhotep I, had departed on a military campaign against the Libyans, those desert dwellers who periodically threatened Egypt's western borders. Such campaigns were routine affairs for Egyptian pharaohs, demonstrations of power that maintained Egypt's dominance and brought back tribute and prisoners to glorify the kingdom. Amenhotep had taken with him his co-ruler and designated heir, Prince Sesostris, ensuring both military success and the continuity of the dynasty. This practice of co-rulership was a wise innovation of the Middle Kingdom pharaohs, designed to prevent the succession crisis that had plagued earlier periods of Egyptian history. As Sinuhe went about his morning duties, organizing the princesses' household and attending to the countless details that kept the royal court functioning smoothly, a messenger arrived at the palace gates. The man was travel-worn, his clothes dusty from a hard journey, and his face bore the grim expression of one who carries news that will change everything. Palace messengers were trained to show no emotion, to deliver their communications with professional detachment. But this man's composure was clearly strained by the weight of his burden. The message he carried was brief, but devastating. Pharaoh Amenhotep, I was dead. The great king, the founding father of Egypt's new golden age, had fallen during the Libyan campaign. The circumstances of his death were unclear. Perhaps he had fallen in battle, perhaps to illness, or perhaps, as some whispered, to an assassin's blade. What mattered was that Egypt's god-king was gone, and the carefully constructed stability of the kingdom was suddenly thrown into question. News of the pharaoh's death spread through the palace like wildfire, but it was news that had to be managed carefully. In ancient Egypt, the death of a pharaoh was not merely a personal tragedy or even a political crisis. It was a cosmic event that threatened the very order of the universe. The pharaoh was believed to be the living embodiment of the god Horus, the divine intermediary between the mortal world and the eternal realm of the gods. His death meant that this divine protection was temporarily suspended, leaving Egypt vulnerable to chaos and disorder until the succession could be properly established. Prince Sesostris, who had been campaigning with his father, immediately assumed power as the new pharaoh, taking the throne named Sesostris I, but the prince was still in the field with the army, far from the capital, and it would take time for him to return and formally consolidate his rule. In the meantime, the palace was filled with uncertainty and fear. Who could be trusted? Which courtiers had been loyal to the old pharaoh, and which might have secret allegiances to other claimants? Who might have been involved in Menhat's death, if indeed it had been an assassination? It was in this atmosphere of paranoia and shifting loyalties that Sinuhe made the decision that would define the rest of his life. As he overheard fragments of conversation between high officials, as he saw the worried expressions on familiar faces, and as he felt the growing tension in the palace halls, a terrible fear began to grow in his heart. Had he somehow become associated with the wrong faction? Was his loyalty to the old pharaoh now seen as a liability? Would the new king view him as a potential threat? The psychology of fear is a powerful force, and in Sinuhe we see it operating with devastating clarity. Here was a man who had lived his entire adult life in the security of royal service, who had never known want or danger, suddenly confronted with the possibility that everything he had worked for might be stripped away in an instant. The comfortable certainties of palace life had evaporated, replaced by a nightmarish landscape, where former allies might become enemies, and where survival itself was no longer guaranteed. Ancient Egyptian court politics were notoriously complex and dangerous. The pharaoh's court was a world of elaborate protocol, carefully managed relationships, and subtle power plays where a misinterpreted gesture or an unguarded comment could lead to disgrace or death. Officials rose and fell with startling regularity, and those who served one pharaoh often found themselves out of favor with his successor. The historical records are full of accounts of purges and executions that followed dynastic transitions. As new rulers eliminated potential rivals and consolidated their power in this treacherous environment, Sinuhe's fear was entirely rational. He had served closely with the royal family, had access to sensitive information, and possessed detailed knowledge of palace operations that could potentially be used against the new regime. Whether or not his fears were justified, whether Sesostris would actually have viewed him as a threat, we will never know. What matters is that Sinuhe believed himself to be in mortal danger, and that belief drove him to make a choice that would transform him from a privileged courtier into a desperate fugitive. As the day wore on and the whispered conversations grew more intense, Sinuhe found himself unable to concentrate on his duties. Every glance seemed suspicious, every silence pregnant with unspoken threats. The familiar corridors of the palace, which had been his home for so many years, now felt like the passages of a trap from which he might never emerge. The very stones seemed to watch him with hostile eyes, and the shadows appeared to conceal dangers that grew more menacing with each passing hour. The decisive moment came during the evening, as the court gathered for what should have been a routine ceremony, but had instead become an impromptu council of state. Officials moved in small groups, their faces grave with the weight of momentous decisions. Sinuhe, positioned at the periphery of these discussions as befitted his relatively modest rank, strained to catch fragments of conversation that might reveal his fate. What he heard filled him with such terror that his very soul seemed to flee his body. In the ancient Egyptian mindset, the concept of cosmic order and balance was fundamental to understanding one's place in the universe. Every person, from the lowest peasant to the pharaoh himself, had a designated role in maintaining this divine order. To step outside one's proper place, to act against the established hierarchy, was not merely a social transgression, but a violation of this cosmic order itself. Yet here was Sinuhe, a loyal servant of many years, suddenly faced with circumstances that seemed to offer him no choice but to violate everything he had been taught about proper conduct and social obligation. The internal struggle that raged in Sinuhe's mind during these crucial hours reflects one of the most sophisticated psychological portraits in all of ancient literature. The anonymous author understood that human beings are complex creatures, capable of rational thought and irrational fear, of loyalty and self-preservation, of courage and cowardice, often simultaneously. Sinuhe was not a simple hero or villain, but a fully realized human being caught in an impossible situation, forced to choose between competing claims on his conscience and his survival instinct. As darkness fell over the palace, Sinuhe made his fateful decision. He would flee, not in a carefully planned escape, not with supplies and preparation, but in a moment of pure panic that drove him to abandon everything he had ever known for the uncertain refuge of the wilderness. This decision, made in a few seconds of terror, would define the next decades of his life and provide the central drama of one of world literature's greatest adventure stories. The geography of ancient Egypt made Sinuhe's escape route almost inevitable. The Nile Valley, where all of Egypt's major cities and population centers were located, was bordered on both sides by desert wastes that stretched the horizons. To the west lay the Libyan desert, vast and largely unexplored, while to the east lay the Arabian desert, and beyond it, the lands of the Levant, where various Canaanite peoples maintained their own kingdoms and city-states. For a fugitive seeking to escape Egyptian authority, the eastern route offered the best chance of reaching lands beyond the pharaoh's direct control. Sinuhe's journey began under cover of darkness, as he slipped away from the palace and made his way through the sleeping capital. The great city, with its temples and monuments, its bustling markets and residential quarters, lay peaceful under the star-filled sky. Guards patrolled their appointed routes, but they were watching for external threats, not for a single palace official fleeing into the night. The irony was profound. Here was a man who had spent his adult life in the very heart of Egyptian power, who knew the routines and security measures better than almost anyone, using that knowledge to escape the very system he had served so faithfully. Physical challenges of desert travel in ancient times were enormous. Without proper supplies, without knowledge of water sources, without protection from the sun and sand, travelers could easily perish within days. Sinuhe was not an experienced traveler or warrior, but a court official accustomed to the comfortable routines of palace life. Yet desperation gave him strength, and perhaps the gods who play a subtle but important role throughout the tale were watching over him during these first crucial hours of his flight. As dawn broke over the eastern desert, Sinuhe found himself truly alone for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Behind him lay everything familiar, his position, his identity, his very sense of self. Ahead lay only uncertainty and the growing heat of the desert sun. He was no longer Sinuhe, the royal attendant, no longer a man with a defined place in the cosmic order of Egyptian society. He was simply a human being, stripped of all external supports, facing the raw challenge of survival. The psychological transformation that began in these first hours of exile would continue throughout Sinuhe's adventures. The comfortable assumptions of palace life, that food would always be available, that shelter would always be provided, that one's position and identity were secure, all of these certainties had vanished in a single night. In their place came the harsh, but perhaps more authentic reality of human existence. The need to find food and water, to navigate unfamiliar terrain, to judge which strangers might be friend or foe. This stripping away of social identity is one of the universal themes that makes the tale of Sinuhe so enduringly powerful. Every reader has experienced moments when familiar structures seem to crumble, when the future becomes uncertain, when we must rely solely on our own resources and judgment. Sinuhe's exile resonates across the centuries because it speaks to fundamental human experiences of loss, displacement, and the search for belonging. The desert sun climbed higher as Sinuhe pressed eastward, each step taking him further from the world he had known and deeper into an uncertain future. The landscape through which he traveled was one of stark beauty and unforgiving harshness. Rolling dunes of golden sand punctuated by rocky outcroppings, with only the occasional thorny shrub or hardy palm tree to break the monotony of the endless wasteland. This was the frontier between civilization and chaos, between the ordered world of the pharaohs and the wild territories where different peoples followed different gods and different laws. As the heat intensified, Sinuhe's court garments so appropriate. For the cool stone corridors of the palace became a burden in the blazing sun. The fine linen that had marked his status now absorbed the desert heat, and the sandals designed for walking on smooth floors provided little protection against the sharp rocks and burning sand. Every aspect of his former life seemed suddenly inadequate for the challenges he now faced, a painful reminder of how completely his circumstances had changed. Water became Sinuhe's most pressing concern. The human body can survive for weeks without food, but only days without water, and in the desert heat, dehydration can prove fatal in a matter of hours. Sinuhe had fled without provisions, carrying only what was on his person, and as his thirst grew, the reality of his situation became increasingly desperate. He found himself looking for any sign of vegetation that might indicate underground water, scanning the horizon for the telltale green that would mark an oasis or a seasonal watercourse. It was during this period of greatest extremity that Sinuhe encountered his first stroke of good fortune, or perhaps divine intervention, as he would later come to believe. In a small depression between two hills, he discovered a muddy pool fed by an underground spring, its water brackish but drinkable. Here, too, were date palms and a few hardy shrubs, providing both shade and sustenance. For the first time since his flight began, Sinuhe was able to rest, to drink his fill, and to gather dates that would sustain him on the next stage of his journey. This oasis became for Sinuhe a place of transformation and reflection. As he sat in the shade of the palm trees, recovering his strength and contemplating his situation, he began to grapple with the full implications of what he had done. He had abandoned his duty, fled from his obligations, and turned his back on everything that had given his life meaning and structure. In Egyptian religious thinking, such actions carried profound spiritual consequences. He had violated Mat, the cosmic order, and had perhaps condemned himself to wander forever outside the boundaries of civilized existence. Yet as the hours passed and his immediate survival needs were met, Sinuhe also began to experience something he had never known during his years of palace service, a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in his adult life, he was accountable to no one but himself. His choices were his own. His fate was in his own hands, and while this independence was terrifying, it was also oddly exhilarating. The rigid hierarchies and elaborate protocols that had governed every moment of his palace existence had been replaced by the simple, immediate challenges of survival and navigation. From his oasis refuge, Sinuhe could see his path stretching ahead toward the rising ground that marked the edge of the desert proper, and the beginning of the hill country that separated Egypt from the lands of Canaan. This was ancient territory, crossed by trade routes that had carried goods and ideas between Africa and Asia for countless generations. Here merchants led their caravans laden with gold and ivory from the south, incense and spices from the east, and the manufactured goods of Egyptian craftsmen traveling in both directions. As Sinuhe resumed his journey, refreshed and resupplied. From the oasis, he began to encounter signs of human presence tracks in the sand, the remains of old campsites, and eventually, actual travelers. These first encounters were crucial tests of his ability to survive in a world where his Egyptian identity might be viewed with suspicion or even hostility. The peoples of the desert borderlands had complex relationships with Egypt, sometimes trading partners, sometimes enemies, always wary of Egyptian expansion and Egyptian power. Sinuhe's first meeting with strangers came when he encountered a group of Aful, Bedouin traders heading south with a small caravan of donkeys laden with trade goods. These nomadic peoples were skilled at reading the desert and the men who traveled through it, and they quickly assessed Sinuhe as a refugee rather than a threat. His obvious exhaustion, his inappropriate clothing, and his lack of proper travel equipment all marked him as someone fleeing rather than someone on official business. The Bedouin leader, a weathered man whose eyes held the wisdom of many years, navigating both desert tracks and human nature, questioned Sinuhe carefully. Where had he come from? Where was he going? What was his business in these remote regions? Sinuhe, operating on instinct and desperation, crafted a story that contained elements of truth, but concealed his real identity and circumstances. He presented himself as a messenger whose mission had gone awry, a minor official caught up in political turmoil beyond his understanding or control. This encounter marked Sinuhe's first successful navigation of the complex social dynamics that would define his years in exile. Among desert peoples, hospitality was a sacred obligation, but it was also conditional on the guest's behavior and honesty. Sinuhe's story was plausible enough to earn him food, water, and directions, but vague enough to avoid probing questions that might have revealed his true identity and the circumstances of his flight. The Bedouin traders pointed Sinuhe toward a route that would take him through the hill country toward the lands of Retchinu, the Egyptian name for the region we now call the Levant. This was territory that straddled the boundary between the Egyptian sphere of influence and the independent city-states of Canaan, a region of complex political relationships where local rulers paid tribute to Egypt when Egyptian power was strong, but asserted their independence when it was weak. For a fugitive seeking refuge beyond the pharaohs' immediate reach, it offered the best hope of sanctuary. As Sinuhe climbed into the hills, leaving the worst of the desert behind, the landscape began to change. The barren sands gave way to scrubland, dotted with olive trees and wild herbs, and occasional valleys where small streams provided water for patches of cultivated land. This was still harsh country, but it was country where human communities could take root and flourish. The air grew cooler, and Sinuhe found himself able to travel during the day without the crushing heat that had made his desert crossing so perilous. It was in these hills that Sinuhe experienced what he would later describe as divine intervention, though modern readers might interpret it as a combination of luck, endurance, and the kindness of strangers. Overcome by exhaustion and still weakened by his ordeal in the desert, he collapsed near a watering place used by local herders. When he awoke, he found himself surrounded by a group of Asiatic peoples, as the Egyptians called the various Semitic tribes of the region who had discovered him and provided basic care. These people, unlike the Bedouin traders who had viewed him with cautious neutrality, showed Sinuhe remarkable kindness. They gave him food and water, tended to his injuries, and asked for nothing in return except his story. Here, perhaps for the first time since his flight began, Sinuhe encountered genuine human compassion from people who had no obligation to help him and no reason to expect anything from him in return. This experience would profoundly influence his understanding of human nature and his appreciation for communities that existed outside the rigid hierarchies of Egyptian court society. Among these hill people, Sinuhe began to recover not just his physical strength, but also his sense of identity and purpose. The trauma of his flight, the terror that had driven him from everything familiar, began to recede as he experienced daily life in a community where people knew nothing of Egyptian court politics and cared nothing for the dynastic struggles that had seemed so important in the palace. Here, survival depended on practical skills tending animals, finding water, understanding weather patterns, rather than on navigating the subtle currents of political favor and disfavor. As his strength returned, Sinuhe began to make himself useful to his hosts, learning their customs and contributing to their daily work. He helped tend their flocks, assisted with simple crafts, and gradually began to pick up their language and understand their way of life. This was a profound cultural education for a man who had spent his entire adult life in the highly sophisticated, but also highly artificial environment of the Egyptian court. Here he learned that there were other ways of organizing society, other approaches to leadership and community decision-making, other relationships between individuals and the groups to which they belonged. The psychological healing that took place during this period was as important as his physical recovery. Sinuhe had fled Egypt in a state of terror, convinced that he was surrounded by enemies, and that his very survival depended on constant vigilance and suspicion. Among these hill people, he learned to trust again, to accept help without assuming hidden motives, and to contribute to a community's welfare without expecting immediate personal advantage. This experience of genuine human fellowship would stay with him throughout his years of exile, and would play a crucial role in the later development of his character. But even as Sinuhe found healing and temporary refuge among these kind strangers, he knew that his journey was far from over. The hills where he had found sanctuary were still close enough to Egypt that Egyptian military patrols occasionally passed through, and his hosts, while friendly, were not equipped to provide long-term protection for a fugitive from pharaohs. Justice. Moreover, Sinuhe himself felt the restless urge that seems to drive many exiles, the need to keep moving, to find a place where he could not merely survive, but truly belong, where he could rebuild his life and create a new identity. That was not defined solely by what he had fled from. That was during his convalescence in the hills that Sinuhe first heard detailed accounts of the lands that lay further to the north and east, the prosperous city-states of Syria and Palestine, where Egyptian refugees had sometimes found welcome, and where a man with education and administrative skills might hope to make a new life. These stories sparked his imagination and began to draw him toward the next phase of his journey, toward regions where he might find not just temporary shelter, but permanent settlement. The moment of departure, when it came, was bittersweet. Sinuhe had grown fond of the people who had saved his life and nursed him back to health, and they had grown fond of him in return. But both he and they understood that his destiny lay elsewhere, in lands where he could disappear completely into a new life rather than remaining always on the margins as a grateful refugee. The farewells were genuine and warm, marked by the kind of simple humanity that transcends cultural boundaries and speaks to universal human experiences of gratitude, affection, and loss. Fortified by the kindness he had received and renewed in both body and spirit, Sinuhe set out once again on his northward journey, following ancient trade routes that had connected the civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean for countless generations. The landscape continued to evolve as he traveled, the harsh hills gradually giving way to more fertile valleys where small communities clustered around springs and seasonal streams. Here was a gentler country than the desert borderlands he had crossed, a region where agriculture was possible and where settled life had taken root in ways that reminded him, sometimes painfully, of the Egypt he had left behind. The peoples he encountered in these northern regions were more sophisticated than the nomadic tribes of the desert, living in permanent settlements with walls, gates, and organized governments. These were the Canaanites, inheritors of ancient traditions that paralleled Egypt's own long history. Their cities were smaller than the great urban centers of the Nile Valley, but they shared certain fundamental characteristics: temples to local deities, administrative buildings, workshops where craftsmen created goods for both local use and foreign trade, and residential quarters that reflected the social hierarchies common to all settled civilizations. It was in one of these communities that Sinuhe encountered a figure who would prove crucial to the next phase of his story, a tribal chieftain named Amunenshi, ruler of a region called Retchinu that encompassed several allied communities in what is now southern Syria. Amunenshi was a man of considerable wisdom and political acumen, one of those local leaders who had learned to navigate the complex Relationships between the great powers of his time, Egypt to the south, the emerging Mesopotamian kingdoms to the east, and the various city-states and tribal confederations that dotted the landscape between them. The meeting between Sinuhe and Amunenshi took place at a caravanserai, one of those fortified stopping places that served as hotels, trading posts, and information exchanges for the merchants and travelers who moved goods and news along the ancient trade routes. Sinuhe had arrived there exhausted and travel-worn, still bearing the marks of his long journey, but no longer the desperate fugitive who had fled from Egypt months earlier. His experiences had begun to transform him, weathering his soft court manners and replacing them with the harder wisdom of someone who had learned to survive by his own resources. Amunenshi was immediately intrigued by this Egyptian stranger. In his long experience dealing with people from across the known world, he had developed an eye for individuals who might prove useful to his own ambitions and the welfare of his people. Sinuhe clearly possessed education and intelligence far beyond the ordinary, yet he was traveling alone and without obvious resources, combination that suggested either great misfortune or great opportunity. Depending on how skillfully the situation was managed, the conversation between these two men, as recorded in the ancient text, reveals the sophisticated diplomatic dance that characterized international relations in the ancient world. Each man approached the other with caution and respect, probing gently for information while revealing only what served his own purposes. Amunenshi wanted to understand what had brought such an obviously cultured Egyptian into his remote territory, while Sinuhe needed to gauge whether this powerful local ruler might offer sanctuary or whether he might prove to be another danger, to be navigated carefully. Sinuhe's account of this meeting suggests that Amunenshi possessed remarkable insight into human nature and political realities. Rather than pressing for details that Sinuhe was clearly reluctant to provide, the chieftain offered hospitality first and left deeper questions for later, understanding that trust must be built gradually and that forced revelations often prove less valuable than those that emerge naturally over time. This approach demonstrated the kind of political wisdom that had allowed him to maintain his independence while larger powers rose and fell around him. The hospitality that Amunenshi extended to Sinuhe followed ancient customs that governed the treatment of strangers in the ancient world. A guest, once accepted into a household, came under the protection of his host and could expect food, shelter, and safety for as long as the arrangement lasted. In return, the guest was expected to contribute what he could to the household's welfare and to conduct himself with honor that would reflect well on his host's judgment in accepting him. For Sinuhe, this offer of hospitality represented the first real stability he had known since his flight from Egypt. After months of constant travel, of uncertainty about where his next meal would come from or where he would spend each night, the prospect of a settled existence was almost overwhelming. Yet he approached this opportunity with the caution that his experiences had taught him, understanding that every relationship carried obligations and that acceptance of Amunenshi's hospitality would bind him to new forms of loyalty and duty. Physical environment of Amunenshi's territory offered Sinuhe a striking contrast to both the desert through which he had traveled and the sophisticated urban landscapes of Egypt. This was pastoral country, where wealth was measured in flocks and herds rather than in gold and precious stones, where political power rested on personal relationships and tribal loyalties rather than on elaborate bureaucratic structures. The air was cleaner than in Egypt's crowded cities, the pace of life more measured, and the relationship between human communities and the natural world more immediate and visible. As Sinuhe settled into this new environment, he began to appreciate aspects of life that he had never experienced during his years in the Egyptian court. Here was a world where individual merit could be recognized and rewarded, where a man's value was judged by his contributions to the community's welfare rather than by his position in an ancient hierarchy. It was a society that valued practical skills and personal character over formal credentials and inherited status. The weeks that followed Sinuhe's arrival in Amunesi's territory marked the beginning of a remarkable transformation, both for the Egyptian exile and for the community that had welcomed him. Amunesi, with the shrewd judgment that had made him a successful leader, quickly recognized the value of having an educated Egyptian in his service. Sinuhe's knowledge of administrative practices, his literacy in hieroglyphic script, and his understanding of Egyptian diplomatic customs made him an invaluable advisor in a region where relations with Egypt were always delicate and often crucial. To local prosperity, Sinuhe's first formal role in his new home was as a scribe and advisor, helping Amenenshi manage correspondence with other local rulers and with Egyptian officials who occasionally visited the region on diplomatic or commercial missions. This work gave Sinuhe a new perspective on the political complexities of the ancient world, showing him how local leaders navigated between competing powers and maintained their independence through careful diplomacy and strategic alliances. The rigid hierarchies of the Egyptian court, which had once seemed to represent the only possible form of organized government, now appeared as just one approach among many to the challenges of leadership and administration. As months passed, and Sinuhe proved his loyalty and competence, Amunenshi began to entrust him with greater responsibilities. He was given oversight of some of the chieftain's herds, a position that required not only administrative skill, but also practical knowledge of animal husbandry, pasture management, and the seasonal rhythms that governed pastoral life. This work brought Sinuhe into daily contact with the common people of the region, shepherds and herders, farmers and craftsmen, and taught him to appreciate forms of knowledge and skill that had been invisible to him during his court years. Physical demands of his new life continued to transform Sinuhe's body as well as his mind. The soft hands of a palace scribe became calloused from handling ropes and tools, his pale court complexion darkened under the sun, and his formerly sedentary frame grew lean and strong from constant activity. More importantly, these physical changes reflected deeper psychological transformations as Sinuhe learned to find satisfaction in work that produced tangible, immediate results rather than the abstract political victories that had defined success. In the Egyptian court, it was during this period of growing integration into his new community that Sinuhe experienced one of the most significant events of his exile, his marriage to Amunensi's eldest daughter. This union, which the ancient text describes with touching detail, represented far more than a personal relationship. In the political and social context of the ancient world, marriage between a foreign refugee and the daughter of a local chieftain was a profound statement of acceptance and trust, formally incorporating the stranger into the family and tribal structures that defined identity and belonging in this society. The wedding celebration, as Sinuhe later recalled it, was unlike anything he had experienced in Egypt, where Egyptian court ceremonies emphasized formality, hierarchy, and the elaborate protocols that maintained social distance between different ranks. This celebration was characterized by genuine community joy and participation. The entire tribe gathered to witness the union, contributing food, music, and entertainment in a festival that lasted for days and included everyone from the most important warriors to the youngest children. Sinuhe's bride, whose name the text gives as Merdi, was a remarkable woman in her own right. Unlike the carefully sheltered daughters of Egyptian nobility, she had grown up in a society where women often managed significant family resources and played active roles in community decision-making. She was skilled in the practical arts of running a household, knowledgeable about trade and commerce, and possessed of the kind of sharp intelligence that thrived in a culture where survival often depended on quick thinking and adaptability. The early years of their marriage brought Sinuhe perhaps the greatest happiness he had ever known. Their household prospered under Merdi's capable management, And Sinuhe found himself father to children who represented a new kind of identity for him, not Egyptian or foreign, but something entirely new, belonging fully to the land and people who had adopted him. His sons and daughters grew up speaking the local language as their mother tongue, learning Egyptian words and customs from their father, but understanding them as interesting foreign traditions rather than as the defining elements of their own. Identity. This domestic happiness was accompanied by growing recognition of Sinuhe's abilities within the broader community. Amenenshi increasingly relied on his counsel in dealing with complex political situations, and other local leaders began to seek Sinuhe's advice on matters ranging from trade negotiations to military strategy. His unique perspective, combining Egyptian sophistication with hard-earned practical experience, made him a valuable mediator in disputes and a trusted advisor in times of crisis. Yet, even as Sinuhe built this new life and found genuine contentment in his adopted homeland, he never entirely escaped the psychological complexities of exile. The text reveals glimpses of an inner life marked by persistent questions about identity, belonging, and the choices that had brought him to this place. On quiet evenings, as he sat with his family and watched his children play, he sometimes found his thoughts drifting back to Egypt, wondering about the fate of friends and colleagues he had left behind, and struggling with questions about duty, loyalty, and the meaning of home. The prosperity and security of his new life only intensified these internal conflicts. The frightened fugitive who had fled into the desert had been driven by simple survival needs. But the successful patriarch and tribal advisor faced more complex questions about his place in the world and his obligations to the various communities that had shaped his identity. The years that followed brought Sinuhe not only personal fulfillment, but also a reputation that spread far beyond Amenenshi's immediate territory. His counsel was sought by rulers from distant regions. His administrative innovations were copied by neighboring tribes, and his name became known throughout the network of trading routes that connected the civilizations of the ancient Near East. Yet this very success created new challenges for a man who had originally sought nothing more than refuge from political persecution. As Sinuhe's influence grew, so did the complexity of his position. He found himself increasingly involved in the military affairs of his adopted people, not merely as an advisor, but as an active participant in the conflicts that periodically erupted between rival tribes and city-states. The political landscape of ancient Canaan was one of constant flux, where alliances shifted with the seasons and where territorial disputes could escalate into full-scale wars with remarkable speed. In this environment, a man with Sinuhe's combination of education, diplomatic skill, and growing military experience was inevitably drawn into positions of leadership and responsibility. The transformation of the palace scribe into a warrior chief was perhaps the most traumatic aspect of Sinuhe's metamorphosis during his years of exile. The soft-handed courtier who had fled Egypt in terror gradually became a formidable leader of men, skilled in both strategy and personal combat. This change was not merely external, but reflected a fundamental shift in his understanding of himself and his capabilities. The rigid social hierarchies of Egyptian court life had never allowed him to discover these aspects of his character, but the more fluid social structures of tribal society provided opportunities for growth and self-discovery that would have been impossible in his former life. It was during this period of growing military involvement that Sinuhe faced the greatest test of his new identity, a formal challenge to single combat that would determine not only his personal fate, but the fortunes of the entire community that had adopted him. The challenger was a renowned warrior from a rival tribe, a man whose reputation for strength and ferocity had spread throughout the region. The challenge came as part of a larger territorial dispute, where custom dictated that personal combat between champions could resolve conflicts that might otherwise lead to devastating warfare. The psychological pressure that Sinuhe faced as he prepared for this confrontation was immense. He was no longer fighting merely for his own survival, as he had been during his desperate flight from Egypt, but for the honor and safety of people who had become his family and community. The responsibility weighed heavily on him, as did the knowledge that his Egyptian background made him a particular target for those who sought to prove their prowess against a representative of the great southern civilization the night before. The combat, as Sinuhe sat alone preparing his weapons and his mind for the ordeal ahead, he experienced a profound moment of reflection on the journey that had brought him to this point. The frightened fugitive who had stumbled through the desert months earlier would never have imagined himself in such circumstances, preparing to fight a champion warrior in defense of a foreign tribe. Yet here he was, his hands steady on his spear shaft, his mind clear and focused, ready to risk everything for people and principles that had become more important to him than his own safety. The combat itself, as described in the ancient text, was both brutal and decisive. Sinuhe's opponent was larger and stronger, with the confidence that came from many victories and the support of his own people watching from the surrounding hills. But Sinuhe had advantages that his enemy could not see, the discipline learned. Through years of court training, the strategic thinking developed through administrative work, and most importantly, the desperate courage of a man fighting for a community that had given him new life and new purpose. The details of the fight, as recorded by the ancient scribe, are vivid and immediate. The clash of weapons, the dust raised by circling feet, the shouts of encouragement from spectators, and the gradual shift in momentum as Sinuhe's superior tactics began to overcome his opponent's brute strength. The decisive moment came when Sinuhe managed to turn his enemy's own aggression against him, using the warrior's powerful charge to drive him onto the point of a carefully positioned spear. The victory brought Sinuhe not only personal vindication, but also enormous prestige within the community and beyond. Word of the Egyptian exile, who had defeated a legendary warrior, spread throughout the region, enhancing not only his own reputation, but also that of Amunanshi and his tribe. This triumph marked Sinuhe's complete integration into his new society. He was no longer a refugee dependent on others' charity, but a champion whose presence brought honor and security to his adopted people. Yet even in this moment of triumph, the ancient text reveals the complexity of Sinuhe's emotional state. The victory that should have brought pure joy was tinged with a curious sadness, a sense that his very success in this foreign land somehow emphasized the distance that now separated him from his Egyptian origins. He had proven himself capable of achievements that would have been impossible in the rigid hierarchies of Pharaoh's court. But these achievements also seemed to confirm that his old life was truly lost forever. The aftermath of the combat brought Sinuhe new responsibilities and honors. Amunanshi, recognizing both his military prowess and his administrative skills, granted him authority over significant territories and their populations. Sinuhe found himself ruling lands that were larger and more prosperous than many Egyptian provinces, with the power to make decisions that affected thousands of lives. The years that followed Sinuhe's victory in single combat were marked by unprecedented prosperity for both himself and the people under his protection. His territories expanded through a combination of military success, diplomatic alliance, and economic development, creating a small kingdom within the larger patchwork of tribal lands and city-states that characterized the ancient Levant. Sinuhe's administrative methods, learned in the sophisticated bureaucracy of Pharaoh's court, proved remarkably effective when adapted to local conditions and customs. Under his leadership, trade flourished between his lands and distant regions. Caravans brought goods from as far away as Mesopotamia and Anatolia, while his own merchants carried the products of local craftsmen to markets throughout the known world. The prosperity this trade generated allowed for improvements in infrastructure that enhanced both security and quality of life. Better roads, stronger fortifications, more reliable water supplies, and expanded agricultural terraces that increased food production and supported larger populations. Sinuhe's court, while modest compared to the grandeur of Pharaoh's palace, became known throughout the region for its combination of Egyptian sophistication and local practicality. Visiting dignitaries found there a level of cultural refinement that was rare in the smaller kingdoms of the time, while local people appreciated a leadership style that valued competence and loyalty over birth and tradition. This synthesis of Egyptian and Canaanite approaches to governance created something genuinely new, a political model that other rulers began to study and emulate. The personal happiness that Sinuhe found during these prosperous years was deeply rooted in his family life. His children grew to adulthood as accomplished and respected members of their community, equally at home with Egyptian learning and local customs. His eldest son became a skilled warrior and diplomat. His daughter proved to be a gifted administrator of family properties, and his younger children showed promise in various crafts and trades. Through them, Sinuhe saw his own complex identity successfully transmitted to a new generation that belonged fully to their land, while carrying forward the best of their fathers' Egyptian heritage, yet prosperity and success, rather than resolving the inner conflicts that had haunted Sinuhe throughout his exile seemed to intensify them. The more secure his position became in his adopted homeland, the more his thoughts turned to the Egypt he had abandoned so many years earlier. In quiet moments, when the demands of leadership allowed for reflection, he found himself wondering about the fate of old friends, imagining the changes that must have occurred in the palace he had once known so well, and grappling with questions about loyalty, identity, and the meaning of home that had no easy answers. These psychological tensions were complicated by practical considerations that made any thought of return to Egypt seem impossible. Sinuhe had built a life in Canaan that involved extensive obligations to people who depended on him. His family's welfare was tied to his continued presence and leadership. His subjects looked to him for protection and guidance, and the regional balance of power had come to depend on the stability of his rule. To abandon these responsibilities would be not only personally devastating, but also potentially catastrophic for thousands of people who had trusted him with their welfare. Moreover, the political situation in Egypt remained uncertain. While news occasionally reached Sinuhe through traveling merchants and diplomatic contacts, it was often fragmentary and contradictory. Sesostrisai had apparently consolidated his rule successfully and was regarded as a capable and legitimate pharaoh, but the circumstances of his father's death and the political upheavals that had followed remained sensitive topics. Sinuhe had no way of knowing whether his original fears had been justified, whether he would still be considered a fugitive from justice, or whether the passage of time had rendered his case irrelevant to the current political leadership. Internal struggle between his growing longing for Egypt and his awareness of the practical impossibilities of return became one of the central themes of Sinuhe's later years. The text suggests that this conflict manifested itself in various ways: periods of restlessness, when the comforts of his established life seemed somehow inadequate; moments of intense nostalgia, triggered by encounters with Egyptian merchants or officials; and philosophical reflections on the nature of belonging that revealed a mind still deeply unsettled despite outward success. It was during this period of inner turmoil that Sinuhe began to compose the narrative that has come down to us as the tale of Sinuhe itself. The act of writing became for him a way of processing the complex emotions and experiences of his years in exile, a method of making sense of the journey that had transformed him from a terrified fugitive into a successful ruler. In crafting his story, Sinuhe displayed the same literary sophistication that had characterized Egyptian court culture, creating a narrative that was simultaneously adventure story, political memoir, and philosophical meditation on universal themes of displacement and belonging. The literary qualities of Sinuhe's narrative revealed not only his own education and talent, but also the broader cultural sophistication of the ancient world. His story employs complex literary devices, parallel structure, symbolic imagery, and psychological insight that demonstrate the high level of artistic achievement possible in Bronze Age civilizations. The text moves seamlessly between external action and internal reflection, between specific historical detail and universal human experience, creating a work that speaks to readers across vast differences of time and culture. As Sinuhe entered the later years of his life, his reputation had spread far beyond the borders of his own territory. He was known throughout the ancient Near East as one of the most successful examples of cultural adaptation and political integration, a man who had bridged the gap between civilizations and created something genuinely new from the synthesis of different traditions. Yet this very success made his continued separation from Egypt seem increasingly poignant, a reminder of roads not taken and possibilities forever foreclosed by the irreversible choices of his youth. The resolution to Sinuhe's long years of exile came in a manner as unexpected as the circumstances that had originally driven him from Egypt. Word reached him through the network of merchants and diplomats who regularly traveled between Egypt and the Levantan kingdoms that Pharaoh Sesostris I had not only consolidated his rule, but had begun actively seeking to reconcile with former enemies and restore stability to the kingdom. As part of this broader policy of amnesty and reconciliation, the pharaoh had issued pardons to various political exiles and had expressed particular interest in locating and welcoming home those who had served his father faithfully before the political upheavals that had followed Amenhotep I's death. The news that reached Sinuhe was more specific and more personal than these general proclamations. A royal messenger, traveling under official safe conduct, brought word that Pharaoh Sesostris I had learned of Sinuhe's circumstances and achievements in exile, and desired his return to Egypt. The message was carefully worded to emphasize not condemnation, but recognition. The pharaoh acknowledged Sinuhe's loyal service to his father, understood the fears that had driven him into exile, and offered not merely forgiveness, but honor and restoration to his former position. For Sinuhe, receiving this royal summons after so many years was an experience of overwhelming emotional complexity. The frightened young courtier who had fled in terror had become a mature leader with extensive responsibilities and deep roots in a foreign land. The prospect of return offered the fulfillment of a longing that had haunted him throughout his exile, but it also meant abandoning the life he had built and the people who had come to depend on his leadership. The decision to return was made more difficult by the genuine affection and loyalty he had developed for his adopted homeland. His subjects had prospered under his rule, his family was thoroughly integrated into local society, and his departure would create both personal and political uncertainties that could affect thousands of lives. Yet the pull of Egypt, strengthened rather than weakened by his years of success in foreign lands, ultimately proved irresistible. The pharaoh's invitation offered not only personal reconciliation, but also the possibility of serving Egypt once again in ways that might benefit both kingdoms. Sinuhe's preparations for departure required careful attention to both practical and emotional considerations. He arranged for the succession of his territories to his eldest son, ensuring continuity of leadership and protection for the people who had trusted him. His wife, understanding the deep currents that had always pulled him toward his homeland, supported his decision despite the personal pain of separation. His children, while saddened by their father's departure, had grown up hearing stories of Egypt and understood the significance of the pharaoh's summons. The journey back to Egypt retraced in reverse the route that Sinuhe had followed in his desperate flight so many years earlier. But where the original journey had been marked by fear, uncertainty, and physical hardship, the return was characterized by royal protection, careful planning, and mounting excitement. Egyptian officials met Sinuhe at the border and escorted him through territories that seemed both familiar and strange after his long absence. The landscape was unchanged, but his perspective had been transformed by years of experience that had given him new eyes for understanding his homeland. Not his arrival at the Egyptian court was the culmination of a transformation that had taken decades to complete. The frightened fugitive had become a distinguished diplomat. The court scribe had evolved into a proven leader, and the man who had once fled in terror was now welcomed back as a valued servant of the crown. Pharaoh Sesostris, I received him with honor appropriate to his achievements, acknowledging not only his former service, but also the wisdom and experience he had gained during his years abroad. The reconciliation between Sinuhe and his homeland was complete, but it was a reconciliation that recognized and incorporated the changes that exile had wrought in both man and kingdom. Egypt had evolved during his absence, becoming more cosmopolitan and more aware of the wider world, while Sinuhe had developed perspectives and skills that made him particularly valuable as an advisor on foreign affairs and cultural relations. His unique experience bridging Egyptian and foreign societies positioned him to contribute to his homeland's continuing development in ways that would have been impossible without his years of exile. As Sinuhe settled back into Egyptian life, resuming duties that were similar to, but more complex than those he had performed in his youth, he reflected on the circular nature of his journey. He had fled Egypt as one person and returned as another, carrying within himself the experiences and wisdom that only exile and return could provide. The tale he had begun composing during his years abroad now had its proper ending, not tragedy or loss, but transformation and integration. The successful navigation of challenges that had initially seemed insurmountable. The tale of Sinuhe, as it has come down to us across nearly 4 millennia, speaks to universal human experiences that transcend cultural and temporal boundaries. It is simultaneously a specific historical narrative and a timeless story about identity, belonging, exile, and return. Sinuhe's journey from security through crisis to wisdom mirrors the psychological and spiritual journeys that individuals in every age must undertake as they confront the challenges of change, loss, and growth. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carried by this ancient story from the dawn of recorded literature, let Sinuhe's tale remind you that even the most overwhelming challenges can be survived, that exile can become opportunity, and that the circular journey from home through adventure back to home, transformed by experience and enriched by wisdom, remains one of humanity's most enduring and hopeful narratives. In the quiet darkness, let the voice of this ancient storyteller guide you toward rest, carrying you safely through the night as Sinuhe was carried safely through his long years of wandering, toward the peace that comes with homecoming and the wisdom that comes with understanding that every ending is also a beginning.